Erastus was a believer who lived in the ancient city of Corinth. We find him mentioned in the New Testament on three different occasions. The first place we find him is in Acts 19:22. There, Luke's speaking about Paul's third missionary journey, specifically about the 3-year time period that Paul spent in the city of Ephesus. The text says this: Paul sent 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, to Macedonia, while he stayed in the province of Asia a little longer. Acts 19:22. We can see from this that Erastus was someone who greatly encouraged the Apostle Paul. He even traveled from Corinth all the way to Ephesus to be of assistance to Paul in the ministry. The second place we find Erastus mentioned in the New Testament is Romans 16:23. Now, Paul wrote the letter to the Romans from the city of Corinth, and at the end of this letter, chapter 16, Paul sends a whole host of greetings from believers in Corinth to those believers who lived in Rome. Now, there's a connection between these two cities. Some people in Corinth and Rome knew each other. One example of this would be Aquila and Priscilla, who met Paul in Corinth. But why were they there? They had been expelled from Rome by the Emperor Claudius. Anyways, one of the greetings in the letter to the Romans comes from someone named Erastus, and it reads like this: Erastus, the city treasurer, greets you. Here in Romans 16, Paul uses the Greek word oikonomos to describe Erastus. The position of oikonomos is related to the finances of the city. In fact, you might be able to tell this from the way the Greek word sounds: oikonomos, economy. Erastus had the responsibility of receiving public payments related to the use of workspace, among many other things. Now, it is a conjecture, but it's entirely possible that the Apostle Paul personally met Erastus on his first visit to Corinth. As a part of the business that Paul was carrying out in the city, Paul may have needed to pay some fees or register himself, and Erastus would have been the logical person that he would have done that with if he had been in that role at that time. Of course, it's entirely possible that Gaius or Stephanos or many of the other believers in Corinth might have been the ones who introduced Erastus to the Lord, but somehow, either through Paul's ministry or the testimony of other believers, this man becomes a follower of Jesus Christ. And we know that he was a dedicated follower of Jesus Christ, in addition to being a notable leader in the city of Corinth. We have one third reference to Erastus in the New Testament, and this particular reference tells us that the man stayed the course all the way through to the end. 2 Timothy is Paul's final letter. It's written in the mid-60s AD, between 10 and 15 years after Paul was in Corinth. 2 Timothy 4:19-21 records some of Paul's final instructions to believers in the church. He says this: Greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus stayed in Corinth, and I left Trophimus sick in Miletus. Do your best to get here before winter. Paul was probably in Rome. Eubulus greets you, as does Pudens, Linus, Claudia, and all the brothers and sisters. So we can see that Erastus remained a faithful follower of the Lord at a time when it was becoming increasingly dangerous to be a follower of Jesus Christ, especially for someone who was of reputable standing in Roman society, as Erastus was. It's possible that these three references in the New Testament are not to the same Erastus, and some scholars have proposed this. However, I would say in response to that it's a very uncommon name. In fact, it would be unlikely that we would have more than one Erastus in the church of the first century. And beyond that, all of the mentions somehow connect Erastus to the city of Corinth. 2 of the passages mention it directly, and in Acts is mentioned that he's heading to Macedonia, which is actually on the way from Ephesus to Corinth, and so it's sort of an implicit association. Beyond that, there's really nothing in the 3 references in the New Testament that are contradictory or that necessitate seeing this as 3 different persons or 2 different persons. So I think it's better to consider the 3 references to Erastus as the same person. In 1929, there was an archaeologist named Theodore Shear who discovered what we now call the Erastus inscription. Here's a picture of it. You can see the name Erastus here. The E is a bit cut off, and the letter, which looks like a V, is actually the way the U would have been written. The next words there are pro-idol, which describes the office that Erastus held. And on the bottom, you can see the abbreviation SP, which stands for sua pecunia, meaning at his own expense. And then stravit concludes it, and this is the verb for paved. So you might translate this inscription, Erastus paved at his own expense for his idolship. This inscription is located on the east side of the theater in Corinth. You can see from the diagram of the ancient city where this was located. The original inscription would have been inlaid with bronze, but that's either worn off or it's been taken out, such that all you can see is the chiseled gaps today. So, what's the deal with paving streets at your own expense? This is just not something we do anymore, but it actually would have been a very common practice for someone in the role of idol. As a political position, the idol was expected to appeal to the goodwill of the people through his own generosity. Notice that Paul's letter to the Romans is written in Greek and the inscription is in Latin. So this is very common for the 1st century AD. Greek was a widely known language and a respected one at that. But Latin was the main language of the Romans, and especially the one that was used in official inscriptions. So Paul describes Erastus in the Greek New Testament as an oikonomos, whereas the Latin inscription uses the word idol. Let's take a look at these two terms to see how they compare and contrast with each other. An oikonomos literally meant a household manager. Now, Paul actually uses the term in a different place to describe the role of an elder in Titus 1:7, meaning that that person had the responsibility over the household of God to manage it. In Greek history, the role was typically found of a person who took care of household needs, but it was also on occasion applied to the public realm. So, for instance, you could have an oikonomos of a city. This was not an official role, but it was a description of what someone did in the life of the city. In contrast, an idol is an official office in the Roman perspective. Historically, an idol had 3 roles that he played within the life of the city. First, he was in charge of public works. This meant that he kept up the streets in good working order, the temples in good repair, the aqueducts would be flowing efficiently, among other responsibilities. Secondly, an idol had responsibility for commerce within the city. He would make sure that the weights and measurements used in public trading were accurate. He could fine violators and enforce city regulations. Thirdly, the idol would have some measure of involvement in planning the games or competitions in the city. Although we should say that in Corinth, we have other evidence that this responsibility was taken care of by another position. So it may not have been a part of Erastus's responsibility, even though it was common for an idol. So you can think of this role sort of like an American mayor. And in Roman history, the idolship was considered an important stepping stone, positions of greater influence. But by the 1st century AD, especially in the provinces that Corinth was in, it didn't have all of that glory attached to it. Nevertheless, it was an important way to be involved in local politics. Now, some skeptics have made a lot out of the differences between oikonomos and idol. To my thinking, this really isn't necessary. Oikonomos may very well be Paul's way of explaining the role of idol using the Greek language. But even if the 2 roles are distinct, it's really possible that Erastus could have held both of them, and that Paul may have been describing him at a different point in his career than the inscription is describing him. There's nothing that requires the letter to the Romans to have been written at the same exact time as the inscription was laid down. So, is the Erastus of the New Testament the Erastus of the inscription? Well, the latest the inscription can be dated is 100 years after Paul. And we know this because the stone was reused in a construction project that's clearly dated to the mid-2nd century. In addition to this, archaeologists can date inscriptions based on the way the letters are formed. Now, most would argue that this inscription follows the form of a 1st century AD inscription. So, of course, we cannot say with 100% certainty, but it's very compelling that you have an uncommon name, Erastus, attributed to someone in the city of Corinth, where the inscription was found, who had civic responsibilities related to finance. That's a pretty specific profile that fits both the Erastus of the New Testament and the archaeological inscription. In fact, the archaeological team that excavated the inscription felt that the connection was very, very likely. Erastus had a position of influence, but it came with many challenges, no doubt. For instance, an idol may have had some responsibility related to pagan temple upkeep and ceremonies that were held there. He might have even needed to regulate prostitution within the city. His life would have been subject to public scrutiny. So some have asked the question, how could a follower of Jesus Christ have been capable of filling a role like idol without compromising his testimony? Well, I think the answer is the same then as it is today. And this is the lesson that we can learn from the life of Erastus. God calls his followers to positions of influence. We need to show his light in the midst of darkness so that he can heal and transform society.